Story 1. As a police officer for over 15 years, I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that cold November night in 2018. I was working the graveyard shift, patrolling a quiet suburban area known for its historic homes and tree-lined streets. Around 2 a.m., I received a call about a possible break-in at an old Victorian house on Maple Street. The caller, an elderly neighbor, reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual noises coming from the supposedly vacant property. As I pulled up to the address, everything seemed eerily still. I approached the house cautiously, flashlight in one hand and my other resting on my holstered weapon. The front door was slightly ajar, which immediately raised my suspicions. I announced my presence and entered the home, my senses on high alert. The interior was dusty and filled with antique furniture, draped in white sheets. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed the temperature dropping significantly. My breath began to fog in front of me, despite it being a mild night outside. Suddenly, I heard a creaking sound coming from upstairs. I slowly ascended the staircase, each step causing the old wood to groan beneath my feet. As I reached the second floor, I saw a faint, bluish light emanating from one of the bedrooms. I entered the room, and what I saw next still haunts me to this day. In the corner stood a translucent figure of a woman in Victorian-era clothing. She was facing the window, her form shimmering and flickering like a hologram. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The figure slowly turned towards me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and longing wash over me. Her eyes, though not quite solid, seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't move or speak. It was as if time itself had stopped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the figure began to fade away. As it disappeared, I felt a rush of cold air pass through me, leaving me shaken and disoriented. I quickly searched the rest of the house, but found no signs of a break-in or any living intruders. As I left the property, I noticed the elderly neighbor who had made the call watching from her window. She gave me a knowing look, as if she understood exactly what I had experienced. Back at the station, I struggled with how to write up my report. I knew that what I had seen defied logical explanation, but I also knew that including such details would likely damage my credibility. In the end, I simply reported that I had investigated the call and found no evidence of criminal activity. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that old Victorian house. I've researched its history and discovered that a young woman had died there in the late 1800s under mysterious circumstances. While I've always considered myself a rational person, this experience has forced me to question my beliefs about the nature of reality and what might exist beyond our understanding. As a police officer, I'm trained to deal with the tangible and explainable. But that night on Maple Street reminded me that there are some things in this world that defy conventional explanation, leaving us to grapple with the unknown. Story 2. I've been a state trooper for 21 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the lonely highways at night. But nothing compares to what happened to me last summer on a desolate stretch of Route 66. It was around 2 a.m., and I was on my usual night patrol. The road was empty, just miles of darkness, broken only by my headlights. That's when I saw it, a car on the shoulder with its hazards blinking. As I pulled up behind it, I noticed it was an old model, maybe from the 60s or 70s. I approached the driver's side, flashlight in hand, and tapped on the window. The man inside looked disoriented, his clothes outdated. When he rolled down the window, I caught a whiff of something odd, a musty, almost moldy smell. "Everything all right, sir?" I asked. He looked at me with glassy eyes. "Officer, I think I'm lost. What year is it?" I thought he might be drunk or on something, so I asked him to step out of the vehicle. As he did, I noticed his license plate. It was from 1973. That's when things got weird. He started talking about how he was on his way to see his girlfriend, mentioning places and things that hadn't existed for decades. I ran his license through the system, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. The man had been reported missing in 1973, last seen driving on this very highway. I turned back to question him further, but he was gone. The car was gone too. There was no trace of them ever being there. I searched the area for hours, called for backup, but found nothing. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a ghost? A glitch in time? I don't know. But I do know that every time I pass that stretch of highway, I get an uneasy feeling, like I'm being watched by something I can't see. I've never told this story officially. Who would believe me? But it's changed the way I view my job and the world. There are things out there we can't explain, and sometimes as a cop, you become the unwilling witness to them. Story 3. As a 911 dispatcher, I'm used to dealing with all sorts of emergencies. But one call I received about a year ago still haunts me, and not for the reasons you might think. It was a quiet night shift around 3 a.m. The call came in from a landline, which is becoming increasingly rare these days. The voice on the other end was that of an elderly woman, sounding distressed. 911, what's your emergency? I asked. Please, you have to help me, she said, her voice shaking. There's someone in my house. I immediately dispatched officers to the address while trying to keep her calm and gather more information. Can you tell me where in the house you are, ma'am? I asked. I'm in the bedroom closet, she whispered. Oh God, I can hear them coming up the stairs. I could hear the fear in her voice, and my heart was racing. I assured her that help was on the way and to stay as quiet as possible. Suddenly she gasped. They're in the room, she whispered, barely audible. Then the line went dead. I tried calling back, but there was no answer. The officers arrived at the scene within minutes, and I anxiously waited for their report. What they told me next sent chills down my spine. The house was abandoned. It had been for years. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there recently. And here's the kicker. There was no phone line connected to the house. I pulled up the call log thinking maybe I had misheard the address. It was correct, but date was not. We launched an investigation thinking it might be a prank or some kind of system glitch. But as we dug deeper, we uncovered something unsettling. 50 years ago, an elderly woman had been murdered in that very house. She had managed to call the police before she was killed, hiding in her bedroom closet. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it some kind of residual haunting, the echo of a tragic event replaying itself, or something more? I've handled thousands of calls in my career, but this one stays with me. Every time I answer the phone now, there's a part of me that wonders, am I talking to the living or the dead? Story 4. I've been a detective with the Chicago PD for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange cases. But nothing compares to what happened during a routine arrest last winter. We had been tracking a suspect in a series of burglaries for weeks. Finally, we got a tip about his whereabouts and moved in to make the arrest. It was a cold, foggy night, and visibility was poor. My partner and I approached the abandoned warehouse where the suspect was supposedly hiding. As we entered, we could hear footsteps echoing through the empty building. We split up to cover more ground. I saw a figure dart across an upper walkway and gave chase. I followed him up a rusty staircase, my footsteps clanging on the metal. He was just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Finally, I cornered him at the end of a hallway. There was nowhere for him to go, just a solid brick wall and a window too small for a person to fit through. I drew my weapon and ordered him to surrender. That's when things got weird. The suspect turned to face me, and for a split second, I saw a look of terror on his face. Not the usual fear of getting caught, but pure primal terror. Then to my disbelief, he stepped backward, right through the solid brick wall. I stood there stunned. I approached the wall, half expecting it to be some kind of illusion or hidden door. But it was solid brick. There was no way anyone could have gone through it. I called for my partner, and we searched the entire building, but found no trace of the suspect. No hidden passages, no secret exits. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We filed our report, but I left out the part about the suspect walking through a wall. Who would believe that? Instead, we said we lost him in the fog, but I knew what I saw. In the weeks that followed, I dug into the history of that warehouse. Turns out it had been the site of a gruesome murder back in the 1920s. A man had been cornered by rival gangsters and brutally killed, right where I had seen our suspect disappear. I've replayed that night in my mind countless times. Was it some kind of time slip? A ghost? Or had the stress of the job finally gotten to me? I don't have answers, but I do know this. That case changed me. It made me realize that sometimes the line between the explainable and the supernatural isn't as clear as we'd like to think. These days, I approach every case with an open mind, because in this job, you never know when you might encounter something that defies all logical explanation. Story 5. As a park ranger in one of the largest national forests in the Pacific Northwest, I'm used to the eerie silence of the woods at night, but what happened during a search and rescue operation last fall was something entirely different. We got a call about a missing hiker late one evening. A young woman had gone off trail and hadn't returned to her campsite. As night fell, her friends called for help. My team and I set out into the dense forest. It was a moonless night, and the trees seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. We called out for the missing hiker, our voices echoing in the darkness. After hours of searching, we decided to split up to cover more ground. I headed deeper into a part of the forest known for its old-growth trees, some of them centuries old. That's when I started to hear it, whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the leaves, but as I listened closer, I could make out words. They seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. "She's here," they whispered. "Help her." I called out to my team on the radio, but got only static in response. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I found myself following them, drawn deeper into the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled into a small clearing. There, at the base of a massive old cedar, was our missing hiker. She was unconscious but alive, having fallen and hit her head. As I radioed for medical evacuation, I noticed something strange. The whispers had stopped, but the forest around me felt different, almost alive. The trees seemed to lean in, as if watching over us. When the rescue team arrived, they were baffled as to how I had found her. According to their GPS, I was miles from where I should have been. I tried to explain about the whispers, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. In the days that followed, I returned to that part of the forest many times. I never heard the whispers again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was aware, somehow sentient. I've been a ranger for over 20 years, and I've always felt a connection to nature. But after that night, I see the forest differently. I've come to believe that there are ancient forces at work in these woods, things we can't begin to understand. Some of my colleagues think I'm crazy when I talk about the forest being alive. But those of us who spend our lives in these woods, we know the truth. There's more to this world than what we can see or touch. And sometimes, if we're lucky, nature decides to reveal its secrets to us. These experiences have changed how I approach my job. I'm more attuned to the forest now, more respectful of its mysteries, because I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, there are wonders and terrors beyond our imagination. Story 6. I've been a police officer in a small Midwestern town for nearly 25 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. But what happened to me last winter shook my beliefs to the core. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and I was on patrol in the outskirts of town. A blizzard had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost zero. I was about to call it a night when I saw a faint light in the distance. As I approached, I realized it was a building I'd never seen before. An old-style police station, complete with a vintage patrol car parked out front. Thinking it might be some kind of historical reenactment site, I decided to check it out. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like I'd walked into another era. The decor, the equipment, even the smell, and everything screamed 1950s. A few officers in period-correct uniforms milled about, barely giving me a second glance. I approached the desk sergeant, an older man with a gruff demeanor. "Excuse me," I said, "but what is this place?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "This is the 5th Precinct, officer. Are you new here?" Before I could respond, a call came in over their radio. A robbery in progress at the old mill. The sergeant dispatched 2 officers, then turned to me. "You too, rookie. Go with them." In a daze, I followed the other officers out. We piled into the vintage patrol car, which to my surprise started up without a hitch. As we drove through the blizzard, I noticed the town looked different. Older buildings, vintage cars on the streets. We arrived at the mill, which in my time had been abandoned for decades but now appeared fully operational. The next few minutes were a blur of action. We apprehended the suspects, secured the scene, all using equipment that belonged in a museum. As we headed back to the station, I felt a sudden jolt. like the car had hit a pothole. When I looked up, everything had changed. We were back in the present day, the blizzard had cleared, and I was alone in my modern patrol car. I immediately drove back to where I'd seen the old police station, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. Back at my real precinct, I dug into the archives. What I found chilled me to the bone. In 1957, there had indeed been a fifth precinct in our town. It, along with several officers, had been lost in a massive blizzard. The building was never found, and the case remained one of the town's greatest mysteries. Somehow, I had slipped through time, witnessing a night from over 60 years ago. I've never told anyone at the department about this. Who would believe me? But it's changed how I view my job and the world around me. Now, every time I patrol on a snowy night, I keep an eye out for that phantom precinct. Part of me hopes to see it again, to unravel its mysteries, but another part dreads the possibility, fearing what other secrets the past might hold. This experience has taught me that as law enforcement officers, we don't just protect and serve the present. Sometimes we're called upon to bear witness to the echoes of the past, to stories that would otherwise be lost to time. Story 7. I've been on the force for 15 years and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in the old Millbrook district. It was a routine patrol just after midnight. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional stray cat or rustling of leaves. I'd stopped to grab a coffee at the 24-hour diner on 5th when the call came in. Dispatch reported a disturbance at the abandoned Millbrook Elementary School. Probably just some kids messing around, I thought. As I pulled up to the school, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I radioed in my arrival and stepped out of the cruiser, flashlight in hand. The front doors were chained shut, but I noticed a side entrance slightly ajar. As I approached, I heard what sounded like children's laughter echoing from inside. My hand instinctively went to my holster as I called out, "Police! Anyone in there?" The laughter stopped abruptly. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and abandoned desks covered in a thick layer of dust. I made my way down the main hallway, checking each classroom. Nothing seemed out of place, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. As I turned a corner, I froze. At the end of the hall, I saw a small figure dart into a classroom. "Hey, stop right there!" I shouted, breaking into a run. I burst into the room, ready to apprehend whoever it was, but it was empty. Confused, I did a quick sweep of the area. That's when I noticed the chalkboard. Written in fresh chalk were the words, "We've been waiting for you, officer." My blood ran cold. I knew for a fact that board had been blank when I first glanced into the room. I keyed my radio, calling for backup, but all I got was static. Suddenly, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in front of me. The doors to the classroom slammed shut, and I heard the sound of children giggling all around me. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I was trapped in that room. Invisible hands tugged at my uniform, and whispers filled my ears. When the door finally swung open on its own, I bolted. I ran out of that school faster than I've ever run in my life. When I got to my cruiser, I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never filed an official report. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that night, and I've never set foot in that school again. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Millbrook Elementary, but I know one thing for certain: some places are better left undisturbed. Story 8. It was supposed to be a simple welfare check. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly old widow, hadn't been seen by her neighbors for days. I'd been to her house before. She often called us about suspicious noises that always turned out to be raccoons or the wind, but this time felt different. As I pulled up to the Victorian-style home, I noticed all the curtains were drawn. Unusual for Mrs. Henderson, who loved to watch the world go by from her front window. I knocked on the door, announcing myself. No answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, a wave of cold air hit me. It was the middle of July, but I could see my breath. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, my hand instinctively moving to my holster. The house was silent, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. As I moved further in, I noticed something odd. All the pictures on the walls were turned to face the wall, every single one. I made my way upstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. Mrs. Henderson's bedroom door was closed. I knocked gently before pushing it open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the mirror above the dresser, I saw a figure standing behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was normal. Just me, standing alone in the room. I shook my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Lack of sleep, I told myself. It had to be. I continued searching the house, but there was no sign of Mrs. Henderson. As I headed back downstairs, I heard a faint whisper. "Help me." It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. I called out again, but received no response. In the kitchen, I found Mrs. Henderson's medication on the counter, untouched for days. That's when I noticed the cellar door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I drew my weapon and slowly descended the stairs. The cellar was pitch black, and my flashlight seemed dimmer than usual. As I reached the bottom, I heard a soft sobbing coming from the far corner. I swung my light in that direction and nearly dropped it in shock. There, huddled in the corner, was Mrs. Henderson. But she looked different. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were milky white. She reached out to me, her hand passing through my arm as if it wasn't there. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. As I scrambled up the stairs, I heard Mrs. Henderson's voice one last time. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't know how else to get help." I burst out of the house, gasping for air. My radio crackled to life, dispatch asking for an update. With shaking hands, I reported finding Mrs. Henderson deceased in the cellar. When the coroner arrived, they estimated she had been dead for at least a week. I never told anyone what I really saw that day. How could I explain that I had a conversation with a woman who had been dead for days? But I know what happened in that house, and it's changed how I view the world forever. Sometimes, late at night on patrol, I still hear that whisper, "Help me." And I wonder how many other souls out there are crying out, hoping someone will listen.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.